The Georgia night was more than darkness. It pressed down like a living thing, a suffocating blanket of August humidity that seemed to drain the air from every breath. In the slave quarters of the Sterling plantation, the atmosphere was heavy with the metallic scent of old sweat and a silent, trembling current of fear that needed no words. Keziah sat perfectly still on the edge of her pallet, a crude wooden plank that offered no mercy to a body already shattered by 14 hours in the cotton rows. At 24, she was a woman whose value was measured not in years or pain, but in ink and ledger marks priced at $950, a figure that reduced her existence to the same category as livestock and farm tools. Her fingers, gnarled and stained with the dark earth of the fields, were intertwined so tightly her knuckles shone like polished ivory in the dim moonlight filtering through the gaps in the cabin's pine slats. She wasn't looking at the room. She was staring into the void of a future that had just been erased. Her back was a topographical map of every time she had failed to meet the plantation's ruthless quotas, a history written in raised silver scars. But it was her mind that bore the deepest abrasions, constantly performing the dark psychology of survival in a world that viewed her humanity as a clerical error. The shift in the universe had occurred 2 days prior, delivered by the overseer Silas. Vane, a man who carried the perpetual scent of cheap tobacco and rotted leather, with a casual cruelty that cut deeper than any lash, Vane had informed Keziah that her transaction was finalized. She wasn't merely being moved, she was being liquidated. A trader from the deep south, a man known for specializing in what the trade called prime breeding stock, was due to arrive in 72 hours. The phrase was a calculated dehumanization, turning a woman's womb into a commodity and her life into a revolving door of production. In 3 days, Keziah would be loaded onto a wagon and hauled hundreds of miles toward the fever swamps of Louisiana, a place where the mortality rate was spoken of in whispers during the midnight hours in the quarters. To the Sterling ledger, she was $9.50 of potential. To the Louisiana trader, she was a vessel for future profit. This wasn't a possibility or a threat. It was a settled account. The transaction had stripped away the last veneer of her personhood, leaving behind only the cold, hard mathematics of the slave market. But the ledger could not account for Thatcher. He was the plantation's blacksmith, a man of iron and fire whose broad shoulders were the result of 1,000 hammerfalls against the anvil. In every way that the law of Georgia refused to acknowledge, Thatcher was her husband. They had stood beneath a massive lightning-scarred oak they called the witness tree 2 summers ago, exchanging vows with only the rustling leaves as their congregation. The plantation recognized no such bond. To Augustus Sterling, the owner, they were simply 2 units of labor that occasionally occupied the same space. Thatcher's value as a skilled smith made him too precious to sell, a fact that formed the cruelest irony of their existence. He would remain here, bound to the forge, while Keziah was dragged into the abyss of the deep south. There, life, built in the narrow, stolen cracks of captivity, was being obliterated as casually as a boot crushing an ant. As Keziah sat in the dark, she could hear the rhythmic shallow breathing of the others in the cabin, each person a library of lost names and stolen children, a collective of souls living in a state of perpetual mourning. The quarters were silent when Thatcher appeared in the doorway, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the moonlight. He didn't have to speak. The decision had been vibrating between them since the moment Vane delivered the news. In the dark psychology of the plantation, there were only 2 paths, endurance or erasure. To stay was to accept the death of the soul while the body continued to toil. To run was to invite a physical death that was often preceded by unimaginable torture. The stories of failed runaways were the primary tools of control, tales of hounds that could scent fear of men who made a sport of the hunt and of the public spectacles made of those who were caught. Yet as Thatcher stood beside her, his scarred hands resting on her shoulders, the mathematics of staying became more terrifying than the geography of escape. "They won't take you," he whispered. The words heavy with the finality of a death sentence. "We leave tonight. We follow the drinking gourd." He was referring to the North Star, the celestial anchor that had guided so many before them toward the uncertain promise of the free states. The plan was a desperate gamble against impossible odds. Georgia to the Mason-Dixon line were the gauntlet of hostile territory. Hundreds of miles were every white face, or the potential captor, and every sound in the brush was a harbinger of doom. They would need to navigate by the stars, moving only in the dead of night, hiding in the visceral, dangerous beauty of the swamps during the day. They had no maps, only the whispered oral histories passed down by the elders, stories of safe houses and conductors who lived in the shadows of the law. Thatcher had stolen a knife and a tinderbox from the forge. Keziah had a small bundle of dried corn and salt pork provided by an auntie who knew the look of a runner. As they stepped out of the cabin, the sterling big house sat atop the hill like a beast of white bone, its columns gleaming in the dark. Between them and freedom lay the cotton fields, the very crop that had built Sterling's fortune and paved the way for Keziah's sail. They moved toward the train, leaving behind the only world they had ever known, stepping into a darkness that promised either the light of liberty or the finality of the grave. The swamp received them like a living, indifferent mouth, a labyrinth of black water and gnarled cypress knees that had existed long before the first surveyors' chain ever touched Georgia's soil. As Keziah and Thatcher waded into the Tikala depths, the transition from property to fugitive was marked by a chilling psychological silence. On the plantation, their lives had been governed by the mechanical ringing of the iron bell, a sound that dictated every breath and movement. Here the only rhythm was the frantic drumming of their own hearts and the high-pitched whine of mosquitoes that descended in gray clouds. The ground was a traitor. Every step was a gamble against mud that had no bottom and submerged roots that could snap an ankle with the indifference of a dry twig. Spanish moss draped from the branches like the tattered banners of a forgotten army, creating shadows within shadows. They were no longer laborers. They were prey, entering a realm where the laws of men were replaced by the brutal ancient laws of the wild. Thatcher led the way, using a staff to probe the muck, his eyes constantly scanning the dark canopy for the North Star, the only compass that remained true in a world that had turned entirely hostile. Behind them, the machinery of the hunt was already grinding into gear, fueled by a desperation that matched their own. Silas Vane did not simply want them back. He wanted the $300,000 bounty that Augustus Sterling had placed on their heads, a sum so high it had transformed the local countryside into a feverish gold rush. To a man like Vane, Keziah and Thatcher were no longer just runaways, they were walking fortunes. The lead tracker was a practitioner of dark psychology, understanding that terror was a more effective leash than any chain. He didn't just use dogs, he used the reputation of his dogs, allowing the baying of the hounds to echo across the water, a psychological weapon designed to drain the will of the hunted. Vane understood that if he could keep them moving, keep them exhausted, and keep them terrified, they would eventually make a mistake. He relied on the mathematics of the hunt, the calculation that two hungry, tired people could not outrun 5 men on horseback with fresh supplies and a singular profitable focus. The bounty had turned their humanity into a price tag, ensuring that every poor farmer and local patroller for 100 miles was now a potential adversary in Sterling's ruthless accounting. Near midnight, the terror became visceral. They were huddled in the hollow of a massive rotted cypress, their bodies pressed together to minimize their profile when the first flickers of orange light danced across the water. The patrol was close. Keziah watched through a gap in the roots as 3 men on horseback waded through the shallower edges of the swamp, their torches casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to reach out for them. She recognized one of the men, a local named Holloway, who had often sold surplus corn to the plantation. He looked different now. The light of the $300,000 reward had ignited a feral hunger in his expression. The men spoke in low, jagged tones about what they would do with the money, their casual discussion of Keziah and Thatcher's capture stripped of any moral weight. To these men, the hunt was a lottery, and the 2 souls hiding 5T away were the winning tickets. Keziah held her breath until her lungs burned, her hand gripping Thatcher's with a strength born of pure adrenaline. The patrol passed so closely she could smell the scorched pine of their torches and the metallic tang of the hose bits, a reminder that the world they had fled was actively trying to consume them. In the crushing silence that followed the patrol's departure, Keziah found herself reflecting on the words of an old woman named Mora, who had spent 40 years in the Sterling kitchen. Mora had once told her that the greatest magic trick of the master was making the enslaved believe they were invisible unless they were working. Now, as a fugitive, Keziah realized that she was finally visible, but in the most dangerous way possible. This was the choosing of suffering that distinguished the runner from the slave. On the plantation, pain was something that happened to you, a lash, a sail, a cold morning in the fields. In the swamp, the pain was something they chose. The burning in their muscles, the raw sores on their feet, and the gnawing hunger were all consequences of their own agency. This psychological shift was the first taste of true freedom. Though they were hunted, terrified, every agonizing step was a testament to their own will. They were no longer tools waiting to be used. They were actors in their own drama, reclaiming their bodies by putting them through the fires of the escape. The suffering was immense, but it was theirs. A heavy price paid for the right to move in a direction of their own choosing. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the canopy, the swamp had taken its physical toll. Their clothes were heavy with stinking mud, and their skin was a map of scratches and insect bites. They found a small patch of elevated ground, thick with brambles and hidden by a curtain of vines, and burrowed into it, like animals seeking cover. This was the new architecture of their lives. The day was for hiding and the night was for movement. As Thatcher took the first watch, his eyes bloodshot, but alert, Keziah collapsed into a shallow, fitful sleep. She dreamed of the 3cc 500 posters, seeing her own name written in bold black letters that seemed to grow until they covered the entire world. In her dreams, the bounty wasn't just money. It was a weight that kept them pinned to the Georgia mud, a gravity that they would have to fight with every ounce of their remaining strength. They had survived the first night, but their geography ahead was even more exposed, and the men behind them were only getting hungrier. The transition was complete. They were no longer the death couple of the plantation's legends. They were the most valuable prey in the South, and the hunt had only just begun. Emerging from the claustrophobia of the swamp into the exposed vastness of the Georgia uplands felt less like a relief and more like stepping onto a gallows. The landscape was no longer a tangle of roots, but a sprawling chessboard of red clay roads and meticulously groomed fields where every horizon offered a vantage point for a scout or a sniper. It was at a dusty crossroads, pinned to the gnarled trunk of a lightning-blasted elm, that they saw the physical manifestation of their new reality. The poster was crisp, the ink barely dry, against the parchment, declaring in bold blocky typeface $300 as reward for the capture of the Sterling fugitives. Below the sum were two sketches that bore a haunting, distorted resemblance to their own features. Thatcher's jaw was drawn with a predatory sharpness. Keziah's eyes were rendered with a hollow, haunted intensity that made her look more like a specter than a woman. The text beneath described them as the death couple, a fabricated title designed to justify any level of violence used in their retrieval. Seeing that number, a fortune that could buy a small farm or clear a lifetime of debt, changed the very air they breathed. It transformed the entire white population of the South into a single multi-headed beast, eyes sharpened by greed and hearts hardened by the prospect of a windfall that required nothing more than a pointed finger or a pulled trigger. The psychological warfare of the bounty was a masterstroke of Silas Vane's, designed a way to ensure that Keziah and Thatcher would find no sanctuary among the poor or the desperate. By branding them as a lethal pair, the authorities had effectively stripped them of the fugitive status, which might elicit a shred of pity, and replaced it with the status of menace. This was the dark theater of the era, turning a flight for freedom into a crime against the social order itself. Keziah stood in the shadow of the elm, her heart echoing the frantic rhythm of a trapped bird, realizing that their humanity had been completely overwritten by this fiction. The $300 was not just a price for their bodies. It was a bribe for the collective conscience of the countryside. It ensured that even the blacksmith who had once shared a drink with Thatcher or the house girl who had whispered secrets to Keziah would now see them as a transaction rather than kin. This was the loneliest realization of the journey, that they were no longer walking through a world of people, but through a marketplace of hunters where their lives were the only currency that mattered. Every rustle of the wind through the cornstalk sounded like the crinkle of a reward notice, and every distant dog's bark felt like a personal invitation to the gallows. Exhaustion finally won its battle against adrenaline as they reached the skeletal remains of a tobacco shed, its timber walls leaning at a precarious angle that suggested it was held up by memory alone. Inside, the air was a thick sediment of dust, and the ghost scent of long harvested leaves, a dry, peppery aroma that scratched at their throats. They burrowed into a pile of discarded mold-dampened husks in the farthest corner, the shadows offering a fragile temporary skin. Thatch's breathing was a jagged rasp, his hands still stained with the iron dust of the forge, now trembling with the sheer effort of staying upright. The mathematics of survival were beginning to fail them. Their bodies were machines that required fuel they didn't have and rest they couldn't afford. As they lay in the gloom, the silence of the shed was punctured by the rhythmic thud of a stone hitting the exterior wall, a sharp, repetitive sound that signaled they were not alone. Keziah watched through a vertical crack in the siding as a young boy no older than 9 systematically threw pebbles at a target he had scratched into the wood. He was a small, sun-denned child in tattered overalls representing the most dangerous element of their journey, the innocence that had not yet learned the value of a secret. The moment of collision was silent and absolute. The boy, curious, or perhaps just seeking a lost stone, pushed open the rotting door of the shed, the hinges emitting a high-pitched groan that sounded like a scream in the stillness. He stepped into the shafts of moted light, his eyes adjusting to the darkness until they locked onto the pile of husks where Keziah and Thatcher lay. The air in the shed seemed to freeze. Keziah saw the boy's pupils dilate, his mouth falling open as he processed the 2 figures huddled in the corner, the very faces he had likely heard his father discuss over the dinner table or seen on the posters at the general store. In the dark psychology of that era, even a child was a soldier for the system, raised on stories of bad people who ran away to do harm. Keziah didn't move, her gaze holding the boys with a desperate, silent plea for mercy that bypassed language. She saw the internal war play out on his face, the impulse to shout, the fear of the monsters, and then a flickering shadow of something else, an innate recognition of suffering. He looked at Thatcher's bloodied feet and Keziah's tear-streaked face, and the Traha-Fend legend crumbled against the reality of 2 broken human beings. Without a word, the boy stepped back, his small hand lingering on the doorframe for a heartbeat before he turned and walked away from the shed. He didn't scream. He didn't call for his mother or his father. He simply vanished into the golden haze of the afternoon fields, leaving behind a silence that was more terrifying than a shout. Thatcher was up in an instant. The knife they had, scavenged from the forge, gripped tight, his knuckles white. "We have to move," he hissed, the urgency of the moment overriding the protests of his joints. They knew the boy's silence was a gift that could be revoked at any second. A child's conscience was a fragile thing, easily broken by the questioning of an adult or the lure of a reward he didn't fully understand. They fled the shed, abandoning the meager comfort of the shade for the blistering exposure of the open road, their shadows lengthening as the sun began its descent. They were moving toward the next station in the hidden network, but the encounter had left a new scar on their psyches. They were no longer just running from Silas Vane and his hounds. They were running from the gaze of the world, realizing that even the most innocent observer carried the power to return them to the auction block. The fear of the boy's eventual confession acted as a jagged spur, driving them through the twilight and into the early hours of the night. Every farmhouse they passed felt like a fortress of potential betrayal, every lantern in a distant window a searching eye. The psychology of the fugitive is one of constant grinding hypervigilance, where the mind begins to hallucinate threats in the swaying of branches and the shadows of fence posts. They were traveling through a landscape that was economically and morally invested in their return, a territory where the $300 bounty made them more valuable as trophies than as people. As they pushed toward the border, the realization deepened that freedom was not just a destination but a state of being that required them to shed their old identities entirely. They were no longer the people they had been on the Sterling plantation. Those people were dead, replaced by the hardened, desperate figures on the posters. Every mile gained was a subtraction from their past, a slow and painful dismantling of the chains that had bound their spirits, long before they ever began to run. The road ahead was long, and the price on their heads was heavy, but the silent mercy of a child had given them one more night to chase the North Star. The sanctuary of the Turner farmstead appeared through the pre-dawn mist, not as a grand estate, but as a humble, weathered dwelling that seemed to hold its breath against the surrounding hostility. Elias and Martha, the Quaker couple, inhabited this hollow of grace, were practitioners of a quiet, dangerous radicalism, their faith acting as a silent rebuke to the Treha's fee-hunted bounty that had turned their neighbors into predators. When the door opened, there were no grand speeches, only the sharp, assessing gaze of Martha as she ushered Keziah and Thatcher into the kitchen. The air inside smelled of dried herbs and woods, a domestic peace that felt almost hallucinatory after the raw terror of the open road, yet the peace was a thin veil. On the kitchen table lay a local gazette, its front page dominated by a fresh printing of the death couple reward notice. Elias, a man whose hands were calloused by honest labor rather. Then the lash spoke of the psychological trap Silas Vane had set by inflating the reward and the danger. Vane had ensured that any white person who helped them was not just a lawbreaker, but a target for the community's collective rage. To help the death couple was to invite the same erasure that the fugitives were fleeing. The architecture of their survival was hidden beneath the very floorboards of the Turner home, a space Elias called the lower room. Though Keziah could only think of it as a pre-constructed grave, it was a narrow earthen cellar, barely 4 feet high, accessed through a trapdoor hidden beneath a heavy oak sideboard. Descending into that damp, sightless dark was the ultimate test of the choosing of suffering. On the plantation, their movements had been monitored to ensure maximum production. Here, their absolute stillness was the only thing that ensured their continued existence. The psychology of the hiding hole was a special kind of torment, a sensory deprivation that forced the mind to cannibalize its own fears. Every creak of the house above sounded like the cocking of a hammer. Every muffled footstep was a herald of the gallows. Keziah and Thatcher lay side by side in the suffocating blackness, the smell of wet earth filling their lungs. They were learning the brutal mathematics of the Underground Railroad. For every hour of forward progress, there were 20 hours of agonizing, motionless waiting. They were no longer the actors in their own drama. They were the cargo of a secret commerce waiting for the tides of pursuit to recede. The crisis arrived, with the thunder of hoofbeats and the aggressive rhythmic pounding on the front door that signaled the arrival of Silas Vane's advanced scouts. From their earthen burrow, Keziah and Thatcher heard the muffled, jagged exchange of voices above. "We have reports of the Sterling pair heading this way, Turner," a voice boomed, heavy with the entitlement of the law. "The reward is hers, dead or alive. Don't let your convictions lead you to a hangman's knot." Keziah felt Thatcher's body go rigid beside her, his hand finding hers in the dark, a silent anchor in a rousing sea of panic. They heard the heavy boots of the searchers move across the floorboards directly over their heads, the wood groaning. Under the weight of men who viewed the house as a hunting ground, the dust sifted down from the ceiling, coating their faces as the searchers shoved furniture aside and prodded the walls with the butts of their rifles. This was the dark reality of the fugitive myth. There was no glory in the hiding, only the primal vibrating terror of being inches away from a destiny written in iron and hemp. Silas Vane's name was mentioned frequently, a psychological specter that haunted the searchers as much as it did the fugitives. Vane expected results, and he did not tolerate failure. Martha's voice, steady and infused with a practiced icy indignation, acted as their shield. "You disturbed the peace of a God-fearing home. Without a warrant and without cause," she said, her tone a masterclass in the psychology of moral high ground. "Search where you will, but do not think your lack of civility will go unremarked in this county." The tension above was a physical weight, a standoff between the raw greed of the bounty hunters and the iron-willed sanctuary of the Quakers. For what felt like an eternity, the boots paced directly over the sideboard, the searchers lingering on the very spot that concealed the trapdoor. The 100 bounty was a powerful lure, a siren song that almost compelled the men to tear up the floorboards by sheer intuition. But Martha's unwavering gaze and the lack of immediate evidence eventually wore them down. The boots retreated, the front door slammed, and the sound of receding horses finally allowed the air in the cellar to become breathable again. They had survived the closest brush with the law yet, but the encounter left them with the chilling realization that the circle was tightening. The death couple was no longer a distant rumor. They were a localized obsession. When they were finally pulled from the hole, the night had reclaimed the farmstead, but it was a night charged with a new urgency. Elias sat them down, his expression grimmer than before. "Vane is closing the exits," he whispered, his eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "The road to the Ohio is being choked with patrols. They've realized that you aren't just runaways. You've become a symbol of his failure. He won't just capture you. He'll make a spectacle of you to reclaim his reputation. The legend of the death couple had grown into a monster that was now hunting its creators. The Trahavandars was being supplemented by private contributions from other planters who feared the contagion of their successful flight. They were told they would move the following night, bypassing the usual stations which were now under heavy surveillance. The final leg of the journey would be the most exposed, a sprint toward the iron-cold waters of the Ohio River. As Keziah looked at, she saw the toll the lower room had taken. They were gray with dust and gaunt with hunger, but the fire in their eyes had been tempered into something harder than the steel Thatcher used to forge. They were no longer just seeking freedom. They were outrunning a myth. The psychological weight of the coming transition was almost as heavy as the physical danger. To cross the river was to leave behind the only landscape they had ever known, a territory that had defined their existence through pain and labor. The Turner house had been a hollow of grace, a brief pause in the relentless mathematics of the hunt, but it was also a reminder of the risks others took on their behalf. Every person who touched their journey, the boy in the shed, Elias and Martha, became a thread in a new tapestry of humanity that contradicted everything the Sterling plantation had taught them. They spent their final hours in the house preparing for the Iron River, as the elders called the Ohio. It was the boundary between two worlds, a liquid border that represented the ultimate choosing. Beyond it lay the uncertainty of the North, but behind it lay the absolute certainty of the grave. As they prepared to step back into the night, Quasia felt a strange sense of mourning for the people they used to be. The death couple was a fiction created by Silas Vane, but as they moved toward the river, she realized they had indeed died and been reborn, not as the monsters on the posters, but as something far more dangerous to the system. Individuals who knew the true value of their own souls. The Ohio River loomed ahead, not as a river of water, but as a black ribbon of liquid iron, the final and most formidable gate in the architecture of their escape. As Keziah and Thatcher moved through the freezing mud of the Kentucky bank, the air was sharp with the scent of coal, smoke, and the industrial rot of the border docks. They were no longer the people who had fled the Sterling plantation. They were skeletal versions of themselves, their skins stained with the grime of a dozen counties, and their eyes wide with a permanent vibrating hypervigilance. The 1,500 eyes followed them like a physical shadow, the price on their heads having grown into a localized hysteria that turned. Every rustle of the river reads into the sound of a cocked pistol. Silas Vane's presence was felt in the sheer number of lanterns bobbing along the shoreline, a constellation of greed that marked the boundary between two worlds. The mathematics of their journey had reached its final brutal equation. 1/2 mile of open water was all that separated the death couple from the reality of their own names. They met their final conductor, a man whose silence was as deep as the river itself, who pointed toward a squat, blackened barge moored in the shadows of a rotting pier. The barge was a vessel of the underworld laden with mountains of anthrate coal destined for the foundries of the North. For a price paid in the secret currency of the network, the bargeman, a man whose face was a map of soot and survival, indicated a hollow he had carved into the center of the coal pile. Descending into that space was a descent into the very bowels of the earth. As the coal was shoveled back over them, Keziah felt the familiar claustrophobic weight of the choosing of suffering. The black dust filled their pores, their lungs, and the very creases of their skin, effectively erasing their physical presence by turning them into the very fuel the barge carried. In the dark psychology of the crossing, they had to become inanimate objects, a cargo of carbon and silence, while the vessel groaned under the strain of the current. The vibration of the engine beneath them was a mechanical heartbeat, a reminder that they were moving through a territory that was neither south nor north, but a liminal space where the laws of property and the laws of God were in a state of violent collision. They lay in the darkness, two souls compressed by the weight of a $1,000 fortune, waiting for the river to decide their fate. The climax of their terror arrived midstream, signaled by the high, sharp whistle of a patrol boat and the sudden jarring cessation of the barge's engines. Through the gaps in the coal, Keziah could see the sweeping finger of a powerful searchlight, its blue-white beam cutting through the river mist like a blade. The sounds of heavy boots boarding the deck were rhythmic and predatory, echoing the search at the Turner farm, but amplified by the isolation of the water. "We're looking for the Sterling pair," a voice called out. The tone saturated with the fatigue of a long night and the hunger for the reward. "The word is they're trying the river tonight. 3 pinehinded darters for the death couple, alive or otherwise." Keziah felt Thatcher's hand grip hers, his calloused palm a anchor in the rising tide of her fear. They heard the searchers prodding the coal pile with iron rods, the metal clinking against the anthrate inches from their heads. The psychology of the hunt was at its most primal here. The searchers were not looking for people, but for the winning. Tickets in a lottery of human misery. Every thrust of the rod was a calculation of profit, a gamble that the next strike would yield the 500 payout that would change their lives forever. The tension on the deck was a physical pressure, a standoff between the bargeman's practiced indifference and the patrol's frantic greed. Nothing but fuel here, the bargeman grunted, his voice a grelly shield of normally. "I've got a schedule to keep in a foundry waiting. You want to dig through 10 tons of coal, you be my guest, but you'll be doing it alone." The silence that followed was the longest of Keziah's life, a vacuum of time where her entire existence was reduced to the effort of not breathing. She thought of Silas Vane, of the Sterling ledger, and of the boy in the shed, realizing that their journey had been a long, slow dismantling of the world's power over them. The patrol, deterred by the sheer labor of searching the coal and the lack of immediate evidence, eventually retreated to their vessel. The searchlight flickered away. The engine of the barge roared back to life, and the sensation of movement returned, not just the movement of their boat, but the movement of history. They were crossing the invisible line in the water, the point where the current changed from a force of containment to a force of liberation. When the barge finally nudged against the Ohio shore, the transition was so quiet it felt like a dream. The bargeman pulled back the coal, and Keziah and Thatcher emerged, like specters rising from a dark grave, their bodies blackened by the soot, but their spirits illuminated by the realization of where they stood. They were in the north. The ground beneath their feet was the same earth, the same mud. Yet it was fundamentally different. It was a soil that did not recognize the Treehausen Kunlodler's valuation that had defined their lives for so long. They were no longer the death couple of Silas Vane's posters. That myth had been drowned in the center of the river. They stood on the bank, the cold air of the Free State stinging their lungs, and for the first time in their lives they were not looking over their shoulders. The mathematics of survival had finally resolved into the simple, breathtaking reality of a zero-sum game. The Sterling plantation had lost, and they had won. They were individuals now, stripped of their chains and their aliases, standing on the threshold of a world that was as uncertain as it was free. The sunrise over Cincinnati was a revelation of gold and pink, the light spilling over the city's spires and the waking streets where black families walked with a quiet, unbothered confidence. Keziah and Thatcher found Mrs. Carmichael's boarding house, a modest brick building that offered the first real sanctuary of their lives. As they sat in the warm kitchen, the cold dust finally washed from their skin. Keziah looked at her hands and saw not the stained fingers of a laborer, but the clean hands of a woman who owned herself. The $300,000 bounty was a fading ghost, a piece of paper in a world they had left behind. They had paid for this moment with every drop of their sweat and every ounce of their terror. But as the sun climbed higher, the weight of the journey began to lift. They were Thatcher and Keziah, 2 names finally restored to their owners. The road ahead would be difficult, and the shadows of the South would linger in their dreams, but as they shared their first meal in freedom, they knew the truth. They had run toward the light until the light finally found them. The story of their escape would eventually join the whispered legends of the Underground Railroad, a testament to the fact that no bounty is high enough to purchase a soul that has decided to be free. Silas Vane would return to the Sterling plantation empty-handed, his reputation as a tracker broken by the 2 people he had deemed commodities. Augustus Sterling would look at his ledger and see a hole where $950 used to be, never understanding that the value he had lost was nothing compared to the humanity they had reclaimed. Keziah and Thatcher were the architects of their own liberation, having navigated the dark psychology of a system built to break them, emerged with their spirits intact. As they stepped out into the streets of the North, the death couple was gone, replaced by 2 people who had learned that the most valuable thing in the world cannot be bought, sold, or hunted. It can only be lived. The journey was over, and the rest of their lives, long and unwritten, was just